If you've ever built a trigger in Storyline and it fired at the wrong time, or not at all, the problem usually isn't your action. It's your when. In this tutorial from Trident eLearning, we're exploring the when and condition sections of the trigger wizard, the part that tells Storyline exactly when to perform each action. If you caught the last video, we covered the media, project, more, and quiz actions. You'll find a link to that video in the description if you'd like to review those examples first. I also want to give a quick shout out to Diane Elkins, Desirée Pinder, and William Everhart, authors of eLearning Uncovered Articulate Storyline 360. Their book's been an incredible reference for this series, and we've also included a link to purchase the book if you'd like to dig deeper. Let's get started. The when section does exactly what it sounds like. It tells Storyline when to perform the trigger's action. This doesn't always have to be tied to a specific point on the timeline. It could also respond to something the learner does, like selecting a button, hovering over an object, or pressing a key. Or it could even be triggered by another event that happens on the slide. As you can see in this example, Storyline will jump to the next slide when the user clicks text box 3. That isn't a moment in time, it's a moment of action. Unlike the action section, where the action determines a list of options tied directly to that specific action, the when section is tied to a specific object. This difference gives you flexibility. You can select an object on the slide or from the timeline, and Storyline will automatically pre-populate the object field with your selection. That doesn't mean you have to select the object first. If you open the trigger wizard before selecting anything, you can still open a drop-down menu and choose the object from there. As you can see, the menu displays not only all of the objects assigned to the slide, but also the player's next and previous buttons. If the slide includes layers, you'll also see the objects assigned to each layer listed as well. The when section of the trigger wizard is divided into 5 categories: mouse events, object events, control events, timeline events, and drag and drop events. Mouse events occur when the learner performs an action with their mouse, or a similar action, like a tap or swipe, on a mobile device. Object events are triggered by what an object does, with no learner action required. Control events happen behind the scenes. The learner may have interacted with the course, but their action isn't necessarily what caused the trigger to fire. Timeline events are based purely on time. When the timeline reaches a specific point, Storyline performs the assigned action. And finally, drag and drop events activate when the learner moves an object from one spot on the slide to another. It's also worth noting that some of these event types can overlap on more complex slides. For example, a drag and drop event might also trigger an object event. So as you build, always double-check which event type your trigger depends on. It'll help you avoid unexpected behavior and keep your course running smoothly. Let's take a look at each of the 5 categories and their when statement options. We'll start with the mouse events section. As you can see, there are 5 mouse events: user clicks, user double clicks, user right clicks, user clicks outside, and mouse hovers over. These might seem self-explanatory, but let's go through them one by one to make sure you understand exactly what each one does. When you select the user clicks option, you're telling Storyline that the learner must select that object with the mouse's primary button, usually the left button, one time, or tap the object once on a mobile device for the desired engagement to occur. Likewise, if you select the user double clicks option, you're telling Storyline the learner must double click the mouse or double tap the screen to activate the trigger. This works the same way as double clicking an icon on a web page or in a Windows application. In our timeline panel video, we discussed selecting an object in the timeline with the left mouse button, then right-clicking it to open a menu of options related to that object. The same concept applies to the user right clicks trigger option. For example, if you're simulating a real-world software process that requires someone to right-click an icon, you'd want to use this trigger. If your learners are using mobile devices, the right-click action becomes a long press instead. When explaining the interaction, ensure your learners know that the long press is the same as a right click. You probably won't use the user clicks outside option very often, but it can be useful. This trigger activates when the learner selects anywhere on the screen except the specified object. It's helpful if you want to provide feedback when a learner selects the wrong item. For example, try again. Select the diagram, not the label. The final mouse event is mouse hovers over. This is great for creating visual cues when the learner's pointer moves over an object. You might display a label identifying the item, change the cursor from an arrow to a hand, or adjust the object's appearance to indicate it's interactive. This option only works with a mouse. There's no direct equivalent for hover interactions on mobile devices. Let's move on to the next category, object events. There are 6 events you can select: state, animation completes, object intersects, object intersection ends, object enters slide, and object leaves slide. We've mentioned what an object's state is in other videos. But for this one, all you need to know is that states are subtle visual changes that happen based on the learner's interaction with an object. For example, you might have a button that's red with white text in its normal state, but when the learner hovers over it, the button turns white and the text becomes red. With that in mind, when you select the state option, you're telling Storyline to perform an action when an object reaches a specific state. After selecting State, you'll see a cascading option appear where you can identify which state you want. You can even add multiple objects so the trigger only activates when all of the selected objects are in that same state. Animations determine how an object appears on or disappears from the slide. Storyline provides 12 animation options, such as fade, grow, spin, and swivel. You can tie a trigger to the completion of either an entrance or exit animation. An entrance animation controls how the object appears, while an exit animation controls how it leaves. For example, let's say you want to display a visual timer on your slide and give the learner a limited amount of time to complete a task before the slide automatically advances. You could create a circular shape with tick marks representing the points on a clock, then assign it a wheel exit animation with a 60-second duration. As the animation plays, the circle gradually disappears, mimicking the motion of the timer's second hand. Once the animation completes, Storyline automatically advances to the next slide. The object intersects and object intersection ends triggers work as opposites. Imagine an object moving from one point on the slide to another. It might pass in front of or behind another object. When the boundaries of the two objects touch, they intersect. When those boundaries separate, the intersection ends. To use either of these triggers, you'll identify both the moving object and the one it's intersecting with. These triggers are great for adding realism or gamification. For instance, you can detect when a moving object collides with another item, like a correct target area or a hazard, and use that interaction to trigger feedback, award points, or move the learner forward. The last 2 options, Object Enters Slide and Object Leaves Slide, work hand in hand with animations. Some entrance and exit animations move objects on or off the slide from one of its sides or corners. You can use these triggers to make other actions happen, similar to how we used the Animation Completes trigger earlier. The next category is control events. These triggers are a little different from the ones we've talked about so far. While mouse and object events respond to what the learner does, control events respond to what Storyline itself does behind the scenes. Think of them as system-level events. They react when something happens inside the course engine, not necessarily on the slide. For example, a control event can trigger when a variable changes value, when a media file finishes playing, or when the course first starts or ends. In other words, these triggers don't depend on the learner selecting, dragging, or hovering. They depend on the course responding to its own built-in actions. There are 6 control event options: slider moves, dial turns, variable changes, media completes, user presses a key, and object loses focus. The first 2, slider moves and dial turns, accomplish the same thing, except one is tied to a slider's thumb and the other to a dial's pointer. Both can be moved manually by the learner or automatically by the lesson. As the learner adjusts the slider or dial, Storyline can change what appears on the screen or how the learner interacts with it, making these great for dynamic visual explanations. We introduced the concept of variables and how to use them in a previous tutorial. Now, you can trigger actions when a variable's value changes. Let's go back to our thermostat example. But this time, instead of chocolate, we'll use ice. You could have 3 images: a block of ice, a glass of water, and a cloud of steam. As the learner moves the slider or dial, its variable changes based on the thumb or pointer's position. when the variable's value drops below 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, or rises above 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, the glass of water automatically changes to ice or steam, all powered by the variable changes event. You can also trigger an action when a video or audio file finishes playing using the Media Completes option. For instance, if you want a slide to automatically advance once a video finishes, you can tell Storyline to do exactly that using this event. The user presses a key option is a little more advanced. Here, you can program the course to perform an action based on what the learner types on the keyboard. You'll need the learner to first select the object and then enter the desired letters or keystrokes. For example, imagine you're simulating a computer application and the learner needs to type yes into a specific field. You could use a rectangle to represent that field, and the trigger would activate when the learner types the correct text. The last option is Object Loses Focus. When the learner is interacting with an object, that object is said to have focus. When the learner disengages, by moving the cursor away, selecting a different item on the slide, or taking another action, that object loses focus. You can use this event to trigger a follow-up action, such as validating what the learner typed or advancing the interaction once they've finished. There are 3 timeline events in Storyline: Timeline Starts, Timeline Reaches, and Timeline Ends. Each of these can be tied to a specific object, the slide itself, or one of its layers. When you assign an event to Timeline Starts or Timeline Ends, that trigger will fire right when the object's slides or layers timeline begins or finishes. The third option, Timeline Reaches, activates when the timeline hits a specific moment, either a set time, like 1 minute 13 seconds, or a cue point you've placed on the timeline. Both methods have their advantages. Using an exact time works best when your slide timing is locked in and won't change, while cue points are more flexible, especially if narration or animations are still being adjusted. Personally, I use both. If the timing is final, I'll go with a specific time. But if the audio isn't finalized, I'll add a cue point so the trigger is already built. Then, once the narration is recorded, I can just slide the cue point to sync everything perfectly. If you have a Timeline Reaches trigger linked to a cue point and it doesn't fire, check that the cue point isn't placed past the end of the timeline. If it's farther out than the timeline's end, extend the timeline or move the cue point earlier so Storyline can reach it. The last when category is drag and drop events, and there are 2 options: Object Dragged Over and Object Dropped On. Object dragged over means the learner has clicked or touched an object and is moving it across the slide, but hasn't released it yet. The mouse button is still held down, or the learner's finger is still touching the screen. Object dropped on happens when the learner releases the mouse button or lifts their finger. That's when the drop action completes. For example, imagine an activity where learners are packing items into shipping boxes of different sizes. As they drag an object toward each box, they could receive feedback indicating whether it's the correct box or not. Once they drop it on the right box, a trigger could change that box's state from open to sealed, showing it's packed and ready for shipment. When you're programming a drag and drop trigger, you'll need to identify both the item being dragged and the target object it's being dropped on. Storyline needs that relationship defined before the trigger can work correctly. If your object dropped on trigger doesn't seem to work, double-check that both the draggable item and the drop target are assigned correctly. It's easy to mix up objects during setup. Now that we understand when a trigger activates, there's one last thing we can add to make the learner's experience even better: a condition. A condition works like an if-then statement. If the condition is met, then the trigger runs. If it isn't, Storyline ignores that trigger. You can also stack multiple conditions. This gives you control over whether all conditions must be true or if any one of them is enough for the trigger to fire. So, when would you use a condition? Imagine the learner must complete an activity or view certain content before continuing. If they come back to the same slide later, you wouldn't want them to repeat that activity. In that case, you might set up a true-false variable to track completion. It changes to true once the learner finishes the task. While the variable is false, the next button stays disabled. When it switches to true, the button becomes active again so the learner can move on. Your trigger might read something like, change state of next button to normal when timeline starts, on condition that activity complete is true. This approach ensures learners don't have to repeat the activity the next time they visit the slide, and it keeps the navigation logic feeling smooth and intentional. Thanks for watching this tutorial on Articulate Storyline. If you found it helpful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next lesson. If there's a storyline feature you'd like to see covered in an upcoming video, share it in the comments below. We're always looking for new ideas. If you're struggling to get Storyline to do what you want, visit my website to schedule a free 30-minute consultation. We'll walk through your project together and get you back on track. There's a link to my site in the video description. The Pug Grumble says, thank you, and have a great day.